Hello again, this is Nick Heath from the Porthouse Fonseca. Welcome to another episode of Fonseca Vintage Talks. The vintage itself has actually finished. It finished at the beginning of next week, so the last grapes are being picked, the last wine has been made, so we don't have a great deal to talk about in terms of the harvest, except to say that we've made some wonderful wines. We're looking forward to seeing how they develop over the coming weeks. So, as we have nothing more to show you in terms of the harvest, we're going to talk about something completely different. We're going to talk about vintage port, and we're going to talk about the different styles of Fonseca vintage port and what they represent. Now, you probably know that the top years, the years which produce the most dense and concentrated and long-lasting vintage ports, are known as classic vintage years. And in the case of Fonseca, the classic vintages are bottled under the Fonseca label. So you can see from the label of this bottle, it says Fonseca 2007 vintage port. And that's telling you that 2007 was a classic vintage year. Now, you probably know that the general rule among the port houses is that when you have a classic year, the wine is a blend of the best wine from the company's individual properties, which are all blended together to make a blend which is balanced and complete. In years where you have wines which are a little bit more approachable and early maturing, the port houses bottle what are known as single quinta or single estate vintage ports, and these are made from the grapes of only one property. And Fonseca is no exception, and Fonseca makes a single quinta vintage port from Quinta do Panescal, and this is a Panescal 2001. You can see from the label it's clearly marked Quinta do Panescal, so we know it's a single estate wine. So far so good, so far so simple, but then things get a little bit more complicated, and I want to let you into what is a fairly well-kept secret, because Fonseca has a style of vintage port which is unique to the company. And what it is effectively a vintage port which has the same makeup as the classic vintage ports, in the sense that it is made from the best produce of the company's different estates, which are Panescal, Cruzeiro and Sant Antonio. So it has the same, the blend composition is the same. The difference is that the Guimarães vintage ports are made in years where the wines are a little bit more approachable and early maturing, and so they provide wonderful opportunity for early drinking. And the best thing, of course, is that they are less expensive, they're more affordable than the classic vintages. So if you're looking for a wine which has the character and style of a Fonseca classic, but you want to drink it earlier and you don't want to pay so much money for it, you have these wonderful Guimarães vintage ports. So well worth looking out for. A little bit of history about the Guimarães vintage ports. Where did they start? Well, the first Guimarães vintage port was from 1931. And in those days, or at that time, what happened was that the Fonseca vintages, the Fonseca classic vintages, and the Guimarães vintages were made in the same year. So very much like, for example, the second wines of the great first growth of Bordeaux. You have the Grand Vin and the Deuxième Vin. In this case, it would have been equivalent to Fonseca and Guimarães. That continued in the 30s, but in 1940s, in 1942, for the first time, the Guimarães was made in a different year from the classic. So there was no classic in 1942, there was only a Guimarães. And this then continued, so in 1944 and 1946, there were Guimarães vintage ports, but no classic. And that is the principle which is followed today. A classic Fonseca vintage and a Guimarães are not made in the same year. As I explained just now, the Guimarães vintage is bottled in years where the wines are a little bit more forward, more early maturing, and more approachable. And can be drunk very soon after they're bottled, in fact, although they do, of course, still have a phenomenal amount of capacity to age, if that's what you prefer to do. One of the things you might have noticed on this bottle of Guimarães is that there is a curious white mark on the front of the bottle. I don't know if you know what this means, but if not, I will explain. This shows you the position in which the bottle has been stored in our cellar. And so the bottle has been stored with a white mark uppermost. Why is that important? Well, that tells you where the sediment is in the bottle. It means that the sediment has formed in the opposite side of the bottle to where the white mark is placed. And so when you're decanting the wine, if you hold it with a white mark uppermost, you'll find it easier to separate the wine from the sediment. Nowadays, many bottles of vintage port are bottled without the white splash mark. And if that's the case, if you find a bottle without the white mark, just hold the bottle with the label uppermost, and you'll know that the sediment is in the bottle on the opposite side to the label. So just to illustrate, I mean, we've got a rack of bottles here, and you can see that they're all stored on this side. Vintage port, of course, is a bottle-aged wine, so it's aged in bottle. And so this particular bottle will have been placed in the cellar in that position. And the sediment will have formed, obviously, in the bottom of the bottle, on the side of the bottle opposite the splash mark. Decanting vintage port, of course, is something which is advisable to remove the sediment from to separate the wine from the sediment. It's a very easy process. It's something which really requires a little bit of patience. It's something not to be rushed. You have to draw the cork out gently and then pour the wine into the decanter slowly to avoid any sediment passing into the decanter. But provided you take it easy and do it and take your time, it's actually not only a very simple process, it's actually a very enjoyable one. And talking of enjoyment, we happen to have a glass of Fonseca Classic Vintage here, with which we're going to start the evening. So, good health to everyone, and this is the last Vintage Talk, so I hope you'll join us again for future series in due course.